Welcome to the Electric Wire podcast. We bring you news and views on the most pressing issues facing Wisconsin's electric industry, from policymakers, executives, and customer and environmental advocates. Bringing you these discussions, we are the Customers First Coalition. Here's your host, Executive Director Kristin Gilkes.
I could not be more excited to welcome my co-host today. I am Kristin Gilkes, and I am joined by Jennifer Shilling from Dairyland Power Cooperative. Welcome, Jen.
Hi, Kristin. What a great opportunity. I'm looking forward to the podcast today as well.
Well, thank you for joining. You were last on the podcast right as you were getting started at Dairyland. That was over a year ago. And we had you and Brian Rude talking about wind issues and how far the company has come on renewables, which I think is a good segue into what we're talking about with Denise today. We're talking about the recently passed Bipartisan Infrastructure Framework. This has been passed by Congress and signed into law by the president. And among other things, there are a lot of energy provisions included in this bill. So we are joined today by our special guest, Denise Bode of Michael Best Strategies, who's going to really walk us through what all this bill contains as far as energy issues. Jen, did you have any issues that stuck out to you in particular that the company has been following throughout this process?
Well, certainly the legislation, both bills, the infrastructure bill as well as the Build Back Better, really is a generational in funding levels and transformational as far as infrastructure. So we at Dairyland are certainly looking at some of the transformational funding investments that these bills will be making with battery storage, with broadband, middle mile, with incentives for renewables. That it really is an exciting time that there was some significant investments made in cyber grid security. So I think there are a lot of things in here for utilities, but also for the public with infrastructure, with electric vehicles and other things.
Excellent. Well, we are going to welcome now our special guest, Denise Bode. Denise leads the federal policy practice at Michael Best Strategies with over 30 years of experience in trade association and coalition management, as well as development of public policy strategies, both at the state and federal level. And Denise is joining us today from Washington, D.C. So we'll turn it over now to our interview with Denise. Yeah. Well, welcome, Denise, to the Electric Wire. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be here.
All right, Denise, tell us about the path you took to get to Michael Best and where you're at today and what your role includes at Michael Best.
Great. Well, it's been a wonderful journey. I started off, grew up in a small town in eastern Oklahoma. My dad was a tax counsel to a major oil company, Phillips Petroleum. So, and my mom was an accountant. So I'm kind of got a tax and accounting numbers background from my folks. But actually ended up really thinking I was going to go into a completely different path, but met a young man running for governor, David Boren, and just really enjoyed hearing him talk about politics and what he planned to do for the state. So helped him out. I was chair of student congress, by the way, at the University of Oklahoma, and my husband was student body president, not married at that point. We were just colleagues. And we started working for his campaign and ended up, he won, the youngest governor in the United States at the time. And we both went to work for him. So that really was my start in working in politics. I've always wanted to be a lawyer, though, so following in my dad's footsteps. Worked there, did energy and water policy in particular, worked in the Senate. When he ran and went to the U.S. Senate. So my husband and I, by that time, were married and moved to Washington with him and ended up going on the Senate Finance Committee, which is the tax writing committee of the Senate, with him, and worked there for 6 years in the U.S. Senate. Then did a whole lot of things in the energy space. I was a partner twice in two different firms. I started off at Golden Liebengood, was recruited to be the CEO of the Independent Petroleum Association of America. And then finally, where we did a lot of major energy policy during those years, was recruited to come back and fill a vacancy on the state commission in Oklahoma. So I regulated all energy and utilities, transportation, in Oklahoma for 10 years. I was the chairman of the commission and statewide elected twice. Then came back and was CEO of the American Wind Energy Foundation, American Wind Energy Association, and the Clean Skies Foundation. Poster child for change. I worked both for the oil and gas industry as well as the leading renewable trade association. And then finally went back into practice because I really like problem solving. So this for me is always my greatest joy. So that's how I ended up at Michael Best. Is leading the federal policy practice and trying to use those many years of experience and helping clients. But my great love always is energy. So you've gotten me on my favorite topic. And as you know, because I've been in this business for 30 years, I know where a lot of bodies are buried. So it'll be fun talking about this legislation we're working on now, because it's got so much energy in it across the board.
And we heard this isn't the first energy podcast you've ever done either. You've got
no. Actually, I started my own kind of energy news called Energy Matters. And in fact, at Michael Best, we still do a weekly newsletter that focuses on energy that I send out to a number of people. But when I was on the commission, the top talk radio program in Oklahoma had me on every day doing about a 1 minute Energy Matters. And so I would talk about some new fun thing going on in energy and then give them a little update on what energy prices, gasoline prices, and what was a trend going on in the energy and utility space.
Very cool.
Well, a great dynamic kind of history here in the past and the front row seat that you've had on energy policy. It's a great segue into what's happening currently out in Washington, D.C. And Denise, really throughout your career, you have seen some landmark pieces of energy legislation pass. Where does the most recent bipartisan infrastructure deal rank in that list?
Well, it's interesting because I think because this bill is not only a traditional energy infrastructure bill, and normally we have a transportation bill every year that addresses transportation infrastructure, and then we'll focus on your energy incentives, which usually is in a tax bill that has that. This is like amazing because not only are we dealing with how we can incent us to come out of this pandemic, because we haven't worked on rebuilding our roads and bridges for a long time, but also we're trying to address global climate change as well as part of this effort. And that means hardening our facilities. It means making sure our grid's working. If we're going to have a diversified energy base, it means we've got to have, better transmission, not just highways, but transmission highways like electric highways. And all of it is old. All of it needs to be repaired. And this legislation that amazingly in this time ended up being bipartisan on the House and Senate side that passed. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Framework addresses a lot of these issues. And that is going to be very, very important for everyone among us, from the folks that are worried about their utility bills every day, as well as about the folks who are really concerned about, well, what's our climate future going to be and what should we be doing with our bills? So I would rank this as one of the most significant pieces of legislation. Not only this bill, but the one that they're still working on is interesting because it is included the bipartisan bill does not include a tax title. That one that's being worked on right now, the Build Back Better bill, which is more of a human infrastructure bill focusing on jobs and employment and what our base is going to look like in the future and incentivizing that, apprenticeship and all that. But it also focuses on incenting, providing, a carrot for all these new technologies that are going to be needed, battery storage, hydrogen, new engines, all that. So comprehensively, I've never worked on any energy legislation that's this comprehensive, if you include both the pieces of legislation that Congress is working on.
Well, as you mentioned, the many components of both of these pieces of legislation, pretty significant. How do you track legislation of this scope? There are just so many pieces to keep track of, so many moving pieces.
Well, let's talk about probably some of the most important provisions in the BIF. And that is the one that's actually been passed and signed, and it's bipartisan. Mm-hmm. So that just occurred, in the last 2 or 3 weeks. That one is interesting in that there is a huge energy title in it, and it does things like really make possible and support the build out of our interstate transmission grid. And that's important because you really can't have renewables if you don't have a real, hardened, modern transmission grid. And that transmission grid also translates to in the legislation in that there's a lot of emphasis on internet and broadband access in low income areas and rural areas. Just making sure everyone's online. And after the pandemic, we've all learned how much we need, the access to the internet when we're all remote. And so it really highlighted a problem. So the two I see as linked because, as all utilities, are kind of working together on this stuff, the electric grid and the internet and the telecom and the fiber, they tend to be closely aligned. And so those are highly emphasized and funded in the BIF bill. So I would say that's some of the most important things. Grid reliability and resilience is huge. And I keep talking about this grid investment because this is the major grid changes. And I had the opportunity to work on these issues in this legislation. And so I would just say, I think it's one of the most important things. I think the other thing is that it really focuses on alternative fueling infrastructure. When I first started really looking at renewables and alternative fuels, you all may be too young for this, but Arnold Schwarzenegger was governor of California. And he built what he called the hydrogen highway in California. And it was fueling stations that could help fuel these new hydrogen fuel cell engines. And that was, the first real, more comprehensive attempt to try to build this out. Well, this legislation provides, sort of this hydrogen highway concept on the interstates across the country. It is the first major step I've seen to try to really move the ball forward on that. And it's really important because, a lot of the, we talk about having electric vehicles. Well, for the very large, interstate trucks and huge vehicles, the battery storage piece of that's still really a problem because it's so heavy. So it has an impact. So really a lot of the OEMs are working on fuel cell engines that can use hydrogen, whether it be green hydrogen or whether it can be hydrogen from natural gas, whatever it might come from. But those fuel cell engines are much lighter and can really work to have, your electric engines, but they are really what a lot of the bets are being placed on. And so you've got to have that fueling infrastructure though. Mm-hmm. And so that's what this bill does. And that is a sea change. So I would say those things to me, in terms of the energy infrastructure piece, are really the top pieces that I really look at changing all our lives. I mean, this will change all our lives.
So you've mentioned hydrogen a couple times now, which is not exactly what I was expecting, because you don't hear that much about hydrogen on the news, or, when you're just hearing about this bill in general. Do you think that some of that hydrogen infrastructure is going to be what Wisconsinites might see first coming from this bill?
I guess what's really interesting to me is how do you basically democratize our infrastructure, really have it so everybody can have an electric vehicle, or move towards an electric vehicle. You have got to have that infrastructure, in buildings, and a lot of the electric utilities, I know particularly in Wisconsin, are really focused on providing that kind of infrastructure. But you got to have it at the interstate, your typical gas station. Those, you have to have incentives for those folks to add that to their infrastructure, because that's where people normally go. You can do it at home through the new equipment, but a lot of people can't afford that at home, or maybe at the office. So a lot of office buildings are basically reconstructing, but the incentives for all those kind of things are going to be critical to allow people to do it. So you're going to see it all over the place. But the fuel cell piece of it is interesting, because it is not just your typical Prius, which is, it is a battery engine that has to be recharged, and has batteries that are stored. This is an engine that basically the electricity is being generated from a variety of different sources, and the hydrogen, which has zero emissions, is going to come from a variety of sources. And so having that hydrogen infrastructure at your gas station, your traditional gas station, is going to be how you and me will really start seeing it. Or like in my office building already, here in Washington, D.C., I have special parking places that you park in if you got an electric vehicle to charge it while you're there at work. And you're going to start seeing more of that kind of stuff.
Well, Denise, as you talk about some of the grid investment, and certainly in rural Wisconsin, rural America, we'll certainly see some of that infrastructure that is needed for transmission lines, because in some of these rural areas, we're seeing more wind and solar development. Do we need to move that energy? Can you tell us a little bit about what's in this and what you see for rural residents, and what this means to them as far as energy availability, or even for workers, what this means for a workforce and potential jobs?
Yeah. Well, I think one thing that's really interesting in the BIF is that there is all sorts of other provisions that we're more familiar with. And there's a dramatic increase in funding, like the Weatherization Assistance Program. That is something that has got huge funding in the program, and that really helps everyone, lower income, rural folks, because they tend to carry the largest burden of energy costs, spending typically 14% of their total income versus others that spend maybe 3%. So that's going to be really important, as we're trying to address our energy costs as well. And so I think that one thing is going to be really important, and I think one of the other things that is going to be really interesting, and this is really included in this bill they're still working on, is that they're placing in all the funding and all the incentive programs opportunities for apprenticeships. So in order to get the tax credit, and as I mentioned, the tax credit piece is in this second bill. So if you want to get a tax credit for wind, you want to get a tax credit, all of the different programs, it really is incentivizing a whole new workforce that can work in these new areas, these new market opportunities. And it is saying that you have to have an apprenticeship program to train people to work in the industry. It also has prevailing wage requirements throughout the bill. So those two provisions in particular are uniform in the second bill, and they support the work that was being done in the first bill. So those are things I think would really be important. And for Wisconsin in particular, there's a lot of really interesting things that folks from Wisconsin to see right away that are in the BIF Act. There's electric vehicle charging stations right away you'll be seeing. I think there's over $80 million that has been over the next 5 years directly to Wisconsin for those charging infrastructure. And in fact, overall, Wisconsin ought to be eligible for over $2.5 billion in total grant funding to invest in the vehicle charging infrastructure. And then also Wisconsin, again, I told you this is a traditional infrastructure highway bill. Wisconsin's allocation is $5.2 billion. Federal aid highway programs and $225 million for bridge replacements. So you're gonna see a works program out there, like with the signs up on the highway, this bridge being repaired, this highway. You're gonna see finally, after a big hiatus, money being, and it's passed. There's not betting on any in the future. This is past. You're gonna start seeing that happening. And I guess one other thing is the public transportation options. Wisconsin's also going to receive, over $500 million on the public transportation options, which I think is going to be really critical and important for people to get back to work, having better, more effective. So those things, I think you're going to see direct impacts.
Well, in keeping with the rural lens, obviously the last couple of years, the digital divide was exacerbated during COVID. Can you talk a little bit about the internet and the investment for broadband, but specifically middle mile? That I work for a co-op, a rural electric co-op, and we're really looking at that space of filling for middle mile as our distribution co-ops continue with broadband to homes and businesses.
I mean, and pardon me for I want to answer the question, but pardon me, because I'm really interested in how you all are looking at that, because, part of the discussion has been, do we want to lay fiber to the house? Or do we want to develop a wireless infrastructure that is nearby, that is targeted towards these areas? Part of the problem for and as you may have known, I was a telecom regulator. Oklahoma was the second state in the country that got deregulated because we wanted money going to the cell and telecom new infrastructure. We didn't want it money being spent on landlines nobody was using. Mm-hmm. So it interests me how you all are looking at that and in trying to solve the broadband issue in Wisconsin, and how you particularly are looking at that.
Well, at Dairyland Power Cooperative, we're a generation and transmission cooperative. So we're the only one in the state with 24 members in a 4-state area, most of them here in Wisconsin, Minnesota, Illinois, and Iowa. So it really is, we own the lines. And so for our own internal use of data, but then also working with our distribution co-ops as they are looking to get into that space. Some are deciding to pursue that, others are not, but I think they're really looking at it. Each co-op is different as far as how they are looking at pursuing that broadband connectivity for their members.
Oh, very interesting. Well, that's really helpful to me. The Build Back Better bill is all over the broadband. I mean, that is where you're going to have billions of dollars of investment allocated across the country. And, it's interesting that you said, that you're not only electric transmission, but you're very interested in having that tied together, because that's exactly what they're doing in terms of looking at, the opportunities and all this investment in the smart grid and the matching programs and the reliability. And all of that was geared towards folks that want to do both, that the grid, you develop the grid, and most of the grid development that's being done for renewables is in rural America. And so you've got this electric transmission grid being built out, but utilize that build out of the grid to build out the high-speed internet and internet access in rural America. And that is exactly what they focused on in both the bill that's passed, and there's going to be billions of dollars being focused on that in the Build Back Better bill. So I think you're going to see, that is probably one of the most important areas outside the traditional energy area that you're going to see come out of both these bills.
And certainly interested in the $1 billion grant for middle mile providers, and typically some criteria we aren't, co-ops may not be, a G&T may not be eligible for, but to specifically see $1 billion carved out for that middle mile is certainly unique, and we're interested in that and glad to see kind of that connecting piece is included in this infrastructure bill.
Exactly. You're exactly right. And the thing about it is that we've always just kind of touched around the edges on connectivity. And I think finally people having lived through the COVID actually have understood now what needs to be done and where you've got the gaps. Yeah. And I think the gap you pointed out is really a huge one and has not been addressed, I think, at all until this legislation is being considered.
Yep. So you were talking a little bit about reliability and some of the smart grid investments made possible under this package. Do you think, I have a two-part question. First of all, how are those going to be implemented? Like, where does the money flow there? Does it flow to the utilities or to the states? How is that being implemented? And then the other question is, there are also a number of electrification provisions in this bill, and we can take some time to talk more about those, but I want to make sure that as we're increasing our reliance on electricity, that there is going to be enough power and enough reliable power to do everything we want to do with it.
In the BIF bill, that is really part of the effort that was done, was grid reliability and resilience. I mean, that was and the funding, and a focus on improving the transmission, storage, and distribution. So that's the last mile. That is really the last mile to the home or the business. And the fact that they're actually focusing on that and in support of our local utilities, and the management of that at the state level, I think is going to be really critical. And that's part of what they are actually doing. The states are, like I said, the states are granted quite a bit, in terms of eligibility that they will be passing on to folks who apply for it, through the states. So I think it is not going to be a federal top down. It's going to go to the states, so the states know what they need and they know their utilities and others. And so it will be a program that will be focused at the state level and not at the federal level, which is exactly the way it should be. So I think that it's going to be a very interesting piece of legislation, because I think this is something that in the past, having been a state regulator, this kind of work has always been done by us through rate cases. And, by giving a rate of return on capital investment was the way we did it. Now, this new effort, which is going to have the federal government providing support for that, it's going to be interesting to see how this actually flows down and is administered. I think the state regulators are going to play a big role, though, in that, And I know NARUC, which is the National Association of Regulated Utility Commissioners, has been playing a big role in talking to Congress about how that should be handled, because you want to make sure that folks that are making these investments, that ratepayers aren't paying for 100% of it. And I think this is about making sure that that all of us share in those positive changes. Now, what was in the Build Back Better bill initially was a huge plan, a clean energy plan that the Energy and Commerce Committee was promoting that would have incentivized electric utilities to have zero emissions and to really upgrade their facilities. But then it also penalized those utilities that weren't keeping up with moving towards, clean energy program. And so one of the things that, and as I mentioned that, that it wasn't a sure thing the second bill is going to be passed, because some of the politics here have been that the moderate Democrats, because the Build Back Better bill is really only being focused on by the Democrats in the House and Senate. And in the Senate, it's a 50-50 margin, 50 Republicans, 50 Democrats. In the House, it's a 4-vote margin. So if you don't have 100% pretty much of your Ds on both sides, you don't have a bill, because you can't pass a bill, even through reconciliation without 51% at least. So what's happened is that Democrats in the Senate that are more moderate and that are energy state Democrats have been very unhappy with what they feel like is too quickly throwing the coal industry under the bus. And that would be Senator Manchin from West Virginia, because he believes there should be incentives for the coal industry to dramatically cut their emissions through carbon sequestration and other means. And of course, those tax incentives are in the second bill, but the clean power plan that they were working on, or clean energy plan for utilities they were working on in the House, would have been one step further in terms of a hammer or an incentive through direct payments to utilities, or that were taken from utilities that weren't following along. And so that whole plan that was worked on in the Energy and Commerce Committee was dropped.
Well, and I think with the failure of the clean energy program to kind of get some momentum, there were some concerns with that, certainly in the utility world. And with that really not being viable in the Senate, that certainly opens up a lot of money that was identified for that to maybe go into some other incentive programs and to other clean energy and renewable energy programs and tax credits. And so that certainly has been one that utilities and the rural electric co-ops have been watching, that SEP program, as it kind of came through the House and now over in the Senate.
Yeah, and and as I said, it was also something that the moderate Democrats on the House didn't like that plan either. So, and I go, this plan that, again, going back to the second one that hasn't passed, the first plan that was signed was about 1.5 trillion in cost. And then the second plan that we're talking about now started out at about 3 trillion as proposed by the president. And now, because again, people are very concerned about inflation and the cost of such another big plan after all the COVID money that went in last year, and then the beginning of this year, and the 1.5 trillion, they decided to scale it back. And so the second bill now is more the size of the first bill, if you don't include some of the tax incentives. So there's in fact, everybody's on pins and needles, because the Congressional Budget Office has been scoring these provisions, and they didn't get a very good score, and so they may have to cut back a little bit more. But there's a whole tax package, as I mentioned, of very strong incentives that really encourage everyone to do all this stuff. But to pay for it, they're doing increases on wealthy Americans above 5 million and 10 million and so on and so forth. And those numbers are changing depending on how much money they need. But they aren't increasing the corporate income tax rate or the personal income tax rate for everyone else. They aren't impacting capital gains. They are not impacting estate and gift tax plans. So those things were all dropped because the moderate Democrats said we aren't going to vote for that. And remember, it's Democrats only deciding this because none of the Republicans are playing ball. But they are putting taxes on a big corporate alternative minimum tax. That's one of the big pay-fors, and they are changing international tax treatment. So that's how they're paying for it, paying for the rest of the bill. Is through those kinds of means, and they're deciding to place all their bets on encouraging a lot of the infrastructure that really would focus on, the internet and other things, and as well as the green infrastructure, battery storage, et cetera, hydrogen, fuel cell engines. They're really putting all of those provisions are going to be incentives as opposed to sticks. So they decided they didn't want to go through with sticks like the program in the Energy and Commerce Committee. They want to try to do it through incentives. And part of it's paid for in that bill, part of it's not.
Yes.
And so how much is not is going to be. So that's why we have a moving target for the second bill and why it's taking a little longer, because they not only have to negotiate with the people that support doing it, try to get a good CBO estimate, they're trying to get, these moderate Democrats on the House and Senate side to say what they will vote for and what they won't vote for. And they're all different.
Right. Well, and I think that's the natural push and pull of trying to govern, especially with a slim majority in the House, a tied Senate, and just sort of what comes to the table about what is acceptable in that larger picture. But I think that is a great segue into, the deal was bipartisan. The first deal was bipartisan. Not everyone's going to be happy with it. Do you see people running on or running away from their vote on the infrastructure bill in 2022, and why?
Well, I think on the bipartisan infrastructure bill, that was really led on both sides, the House and Senate, by Republicans and Democrats working together. And so I think, the big issue that when you think of Republicans, that didn't vote for the bill, the one that was passed, is people are very concerned about inflation. Now, I have to say, over the last year or two and the prior administration, there was a lot of money being spent that wasn't being paid for. And so, our deficit went through the roof. And then the new administration came in and they went right back at it with yet another COVID bill and a big spend. So again, deficit even higher. And now with all this spending going on and not all being paid for, it is really taking a toll in terms of the deficit, but now we're starting to see it show up with inflation. And that is really biting people at the pocketbook, at the grocery store, as well as at the gas pump. And so, a lot of folks are saying this bipartisan infrastructure bill is going to create lots of jobs. So that is really a positive, and it's going to address some of these things that, for example, you're at the pump. Well, if you've got alternatives to gasoline, then you're going to have greater diversity in how you fuel your car. So that should take out some of the pressure on the cost of fuel at the pump. That's at least what's being said, and discussed. So the jobs in that are the things people are running on. The things that people are attacking is how big the deficit is, how that's impacting inflation, and how that's hurting people at their pocketbook right now. So, in terms of the second bill, there's a lot of pause right now on the second bill because it's, again, another $1 trillion plus of spending. And there's a lot of concern that this is going to exacerbate the deficit and inflation. And so, you're now hearing Senator Manchin and others on the moderate Democrat side saying, we ought to see kind of how this plays out before we spend all this extra money and so it's going to be interesting to see if the leader Schumer from New York in the Senate and Speaker Pelosi, in the House can persuade the moderate Democrats to take on more spending.
Yeah.
On the House side, she actually lost on Friday when they voted on the infrastructure bill. She actually lost one of her key Democrats that didn't vote for it. One of these moderates, many of them did, but on the Senate side, it's a new ball game, and so negotiations are now beginning. They tried to pre-negotiate everything with the Senate, so House members wouldn't have to vote on something that wasn't passed. Because that's what killed them several years ago in the midterm elections. Is the Speaker forced the Democrats to take a vote on something that the Senate would not pass. And so they all, were impacted at the elections.
Yes. Well, as I like to say, you can be sure of three things: death, taxes, and there's always another election.
Exactly right. It really will be, though.
So just for everyone listening, and I by no means consider myself an expert on federal energy policy, so this is really helpful to me. And Denise, I just want to summarize. So for people listening, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Framework was $1.5 trillion. It's already been signed. It focused on transmission, reliability, smart grid investments, alternative fueling infrastructure and electrification, and weatherization as it relates to energy. Still to come, there is a Build Back Better plan. It started as a proposal of about $3 trillion. It's scaled back now to 1.5 trillion and could be scaled back further still. There's some debate over whether or not we should continue to wait and see what happens first. But in that bill, as it relates to energy, energy storage, hydrogen, incentives, and broadband.
Big tax title. There's the fact that there's a big tax title in there that impacts all energy is critical. So I think, the first bill, there wasn't a tax title. This has a tax title. So that means, what's up in the air is how it gets paid for. And remember, they started off by having an increase in our income tax rate, both personal and corporate, and capital gains, and basically a big impact on farmers and retirees, in that they had a huge estate tax increase on taxes there, and all that kind of has come out. But just remember, when they're looking for money, some of that could sneak back in, so everybody's watching it like a hawk, right?
Got it. Thank you. That was helpful. Let's talk for just a moment about the electrification provisions that were in the BIF. There's money for electric vehicle charging stations. Maybe you could tell us more about that and why that was a priority for this administration.
Well, I think that what was key for this administration is really to make a sea change in terms of our future. Because obviously, with the kind of reports that are out there on carbon emissions and our future, that was a promise that President Biden made, is that he would not just talk the talk, but walk it. And so his proposal was all about a comprehensive look and money that would help all of us at the smallest levels of government build out this electric highway for us in particular, and also to go back to kind of what we talked about in the prior administration, try to harden our grid, and also to make it more secure against cybersecurity attacks from foreign powers. So all those things had kind of gotten started, and then hadn't really been investments in any of those things. Then we had COVID, and we really realized how much our infrastructure had failed us and continued to fail our kids, and all of us who were sick and moved to telehealth. So from a health standpoint, a children's standpoint, and the national security standpoint, that was what was driving it. And it was a bipartisan effort because everyone felt like, we need to have this build out. And remember our interstate highway systems and all the gasoline stations, those were built by the private sector. The highways were built by the federal government and the state government, but the fueling was built by the private sector. So how do we incentivize? How do we support at the state and local and interstate level? How do we support an alternative being added? So first of all, putting money behind it so that the actual companies that own and expand all those fueling stations around the country, that's part of it. But which incentivizes the private sector to add to that. But also building out something that, frankly, even folks in the traditional fossil fuel industries are interested in, which is diversifying their portfolios, because they see the writing on the wall that, it's not just going to be a fossil fuel or oil and gas and coal economy, that it's going to be an all of the above economy. So they're looking at, okay, so if we're going to do hydrogen, don't you have to transport that hydrogen, and ammonia and other, fuels? Don't you have to transport that safely? So why can't, instead of, transporting natural gas or oil through those pipes, why can't you diversify and utilize those to get hydrogen to the marketplace, or to use ammonia, that kind of fueling? So there's a lot of, it's created sort of an entrepreneurial boost, which I've seen, I haven't seen in my lifetime, truly, the kind of big change. I saw the sea change from oil to natural gas. This is a sea change for the traditional energy sector to look at how can hydrogen really change this, and how can we make money off controlling emissions. So some companies are even putting in place new business sectors. Okay, we're going to go out and sequester carbon from coal. We're going to sequester carbon and others from, our, like these major, places where they're making chemicals. And we're going to take that emissions and we're going to sequester that, and we're going to really bring down emissions across the country. And so every one of these companies is creating new businesses, and they're re-looking at their model. And so it is the most comprehensive, like, mind change, sea change, and how the whole energy industry, not just the alternatives or the renewable industry, but the traditional, we used to call the major oil companies, they're all rethinking what they want their future to be like. And also because their investors are demanding it. Yeah. So consumers and investors. So it's a really amazing time to be alive in the energy space, to see that happening. And this legislation is driving it, and that's why it's so critical, because, sometimes it takes a carrot to get people to move down the pike towards, greater electrification. We can't have, all these electric vehicles on the roads, and we can't have better, more zero emissions if we don't redo our grid, both, at the last mile as well as, your interstate transmission highways. So,
well, thank you so much. This is really, your knowledge. I think this demonstrates this is really transformational public policy that is happening right now, and a lot of interest in it. And so I thank you very much for your insight. And I want to make sure that Kristin always has a great kind of signature question at the end that we like to ask the guests. To the last question I ask all of our guests is, if you had all the power in the industry, what would you do with it? What would you do first?
I think what is really critical is to get our interstate transmission grid built out. I think that's the most important thing that can be done right now, because everything else relies on that, is the ability to move power, and also to help the least among us. So probably that. Thank you, Denise.
It was lovely having you on. I learned a lot, and I really appreciate you joining.
Always a joy to be with you. And
Thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in. Please support our work. You can subscribe to the Electric Wire podcast if you haven't already, and you can follow us on Twitter at The Electric Wire. Thanks also to the members of the Customers First Coalition for supporting this podcast. Our members are Dairyland Power Cooperative, Madison Gas and Electric, the Municipal Electric Utilities of Wisconsin, WPPI Energy, Renew Wisconsin, the Citizens Utility Board, the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers Local 2150, and the Wisconsin Electric Cooperatives Association. Thanks again for listening. We'll have a new episode next month.